Yeah, lovely. Thanks, Scott. We seem to have a very cozy group. I know we've got many more that have actually registered for the session, so we will kick off and hope that we get a few more coming through. Otherwise, we'll have a very intimate discussion around these issues. So really today, we've come together with our joint C and BASIS Commonwealth Climate Conversations, as we call them. And we try and talk about sustainability issues in general, but typically we will have this focus on climate change issues, emissions, etc. is the main focus, but we've got that whole breadth of sustainability and how it impacts on our sports sector and what we can do about it. Really importantly, what we can do, what our actions are. So today we're focusing on energy and the current energy crisis that we see globally at the moment. But before we jump into that, I should do a quick introduction for people who don't know me. From the accent, you'll know I'm from the British side of things. So I'm Russell Seymour. I'm chair of BASIS, British Association for Sustainable Sport, and we effectively are the equivalent to C in the UK. And so we try and introduce sustainability principles into sport at all levels, from professional elite sport in major venues, right the way through to, and very importantly, through to recreational sport, and even physical activity, exercise in the environment, etc. So we try and talk across all of those areas of sport and physical activity. I'll give a quick introduction. I'm going to hand over to Phil, who's also from the UK side, and then over to Michael as well to talk about some of these issues. And I'll ask both to give them a more full introduction just before they start speaking as well. We were due to have somebody that we know well over this side with BASIS. Alex Dovey was going to be with us. He's the operational manager for a company called Professional Energy Services, which in fact was based in Australia originally. And I can't remember the Australian name. It may be one that some of you know, but they had a different name in Australia. They came over to the UK. Alex took over the UK office and then bought out the company and operates the UK side of it here. But he had experience of both sides of both UK based and Australian based energy markets, and then a really good overview of global energy markets. So it was going to be his role, and he's very apologetic he can't come. Something important has come up, and I did talk it through with him yesterday and tried to persuade him, but it was genuine. He really couldn't be here today with us. And he was going to talk about the markets and the volatility. Now, I am absolutely no expert in this area, but just sort of a summary from us, from my conversation with Alex. We are in a very volatile market at the moment, and I guess people know that if you're managing any kind of sports venue involved in sports in any way. Costs at the moment are increasing, especially around energy. From a UK perspective, there's all sorts of things that are going on to make the markets a bit volatile. Obviously, we've got a war in Europe at the moment with Russia invading Ukraine, and Europe depends on fossil fuels, unfortunately, but fossil fuels from Russia. So that stopping that supply coming through has been problematic and has caused issues around supply. And whenever you've got reduced supply, typically the response from the markets will be increasing costs, because you're then charging what the market will allow you to charge as people become, I guess, increasingly desperate to try and secure what they need. So that's pushing up prices. But we've got issues around infrastructure as well. So, for example, in France, their nuclear power stations are aging, and some of them are at the end of life, and there's a potential that some will shut down over the winter. Obviously safely and in a planned way. But if that happens, then their reliance on gas will increase. The market will then need to absorb that, and prices again will go up. We've had a really mild autumn in the UK so far, so domestic heating hasn't been an issue. But this week, and you can see that I've got a few layers on. I'm actually sat in my converted garage as my office, and it's actually about 4 degrees centigrade outside and quite chilly. But we've not been putting heating on so far, so we've not had that energy demand. But this week we're looking at a cold snap. We're looking at snow, we're looking at minus temperatures. So that demand's going to go up. So suddenly that market again is going to become volatile and prices will jump up. There's issues about gas storage and access and actually getting gas into the country. You'll notice that most of what I'm talking about here is fossil fuel based, which is fundamentally something we don't really want to approach. But this is what the market's still based upon. And one of the frustrations, I think, is we've still got energy companies that are making massive profits out of this, massive unexpected profits from this, in terms of billions of pounds or dollars in a quarter. And it's because we're not paying the cost of what it takes to bring it out of the ground. We're paying the cost of what the market will bear, and they're quite different things. So again, that adds into the volatility as well. That it's a market-based approach at the moment, and that makes it actually really quite difficult to predict where we're going to be. I know the points in time over the last 6 months or so, we were averaging around, let's say, 15 pence per kilowatt hour for our electricity. We've had points where it's gone to nearly 10 times that amount. It's stabilized now around 30 to 40 pence per kilowatt hour, so about 2 to 2.5, 3 times. But that's a huge impact for anybody who's been planning. And I know of venues that were maybe around 800, 900,000 pounds a year for their energy costs, and are now topping 2.5 to 3 million pounds. So it's a huge impact on venues and how venues work. But I think from the fossil fuel perspective, so that's all based on fossil fuels. One thing that really I find frustrating is that certainly in the UK, our renewables, the price that you charge for renewables are pegged to the gas prices. So our renewables are going up. So those organizations that we could say did the right thing in the first place and have gone for a renewable contract are still seeing price inflation, price increases, because the markets peg renewable tariffs to gas prices. Now we're looking at legislation to change that, but in the short term, we should be rewarding people who took that step to go to renewables, but they're still being effectively financially punished, even though there should be no change in the delivery for them. Arguably this all comes from one mains system, and you're only, it's a purchase agreement that you've got, rather than you're directly, your electrons are not coming necessarily directly from that renewable source. But it just seems a slight perverse problem with the market as it is. That's a few of my thoughts. I was going to ask Catherine if there's because obviously I've just spoken from a UK perspective, but anything from an Australia perspective that you can add into that in terms of your markets and how things are working.
Yeah, no, thanks, Russ. And it's always interesting because I think you're right. There are so many things going on at a global scale that they are impacting, whether you're in New Zealand, whether you're in Australia, whether you're in the UK. And for those Australians who are always keeping up with the news, there is a conversation that's due to happen between the states and the federal government right here, right now, as to should they actually cap some of the prices on fossil fuels. And it's interesting, you talk about market-based outcomes and market-based solutions where government intervention here is seriously being contemplated. So to just try and ease that pressure, there are people who argue that that is the right solution. There are people who argue that if you cap, then it will actually distort the market and you'll only see prices increase. So it's, in the longer term. So there's some real interesting dynamics happening here in Australia right now as, states and the federal government almost talk about whose responsibility and jurisdiction is it in terms of managing energy prices. But we do know that it's impacting sport. We do know it's impacting households, which means the capacity to participate in sport. So all of those increased cost of living pressures are really starting to be at the forefront of a lot of the discussions here. And you do see as a result, as many Australians would know, I'm in New South Wales. We do not have a lot of gas. It's definitely a fossil fuel dependent energy market here, which I think is a little bit different, Russ, than in the UK. I know in New South, gas is only less than 5% of our energy market. So it's tiny. So, and some renewables, goodness, are actually, you know, a higher percentage of the total market on a state basis. And probably the other thing is, you know, that has also raised the fact of, you know, nuclear is coming back on the agenda in terms of the energy mix, to see if that can be, you know, the way forward. So I do think that's kind of interesting. We're operating in a global market, but there's some domestic issues that sort of come in and overlay that a little bit. But I think we're all playing in that bigger market, because the war in Ukraine and the impacts that's happening on a global scale will be the bigger influences here.
Yeah.
I'm curious as to know some of the sports people, as you know, how are they feeling in terms of impact on them over time? But maybe over to you, Russ, and hear from some of our other panel members today.
Yeah. We'll draw in our audience, hopefully, as we go. I mean, I think that's interesting, because sometimes this does then come down to the impact on households, and participation in sport, spectatorship. You know, if cost of living is going up, and a big part of that is energy, it is going to impact on our venues and on recreational participation as well. And just to mention the market over in the UK, we're probably around we're 2% or less for coal. You know, we've pretty much wiped out coal completely, but we've got a small amount. One of our coal-fired power stations has come back online for the winter, just in case, to avoid any kind of blackouts. I think we're around 18% for nuclear at the moment, but we've got a couple of nuclear projects that are starting up. Our current government think it's a way to go. We can argue that either way. And then we're roughly 50-50 on gas, renewables. Sometimes renewables can come up, and we've had more than half of our production at times for the entire country has been from offshore wind. A small amount of onshore wind that we've got, and various other renewables, but we're roughly half and half. Gas, renewables is our energy mix. I've gone on for rather a long time. I'm going to hand over to Phil, who's from our side of the globe, our side of the world, and is sustainability manager at the Royal Yachting Association. But Phil, maybe you can talk a bit from that recreational perspective, and maybe some of the impacts and what you've learned from your clubs. Maybe give yourself a slightly better introduction than what I've just done as well.
Great, thanks, Russ. Yes, I'm sustainability manager at the RWA. I've been there, I suppose, 3 years now, 3 and a bit years. And my background's actually in engineering originally, and I worked for a long time at the Centre for Alternative Technology in Mid Wales, so working on renewables and sustainable construction and so on. So my interest is often from a technical perspective, and yeah, I mean, obviously, the organisation, the RWA itself, we're seeing huge impacts from energy price increases, and I'll talk a little bit about our particular situation. But we decided, because we were getting lots of inquiries from our clubs, to run a kind of cost of living survey, and we've put that out we have around 1,500 clubs in total, plus a whole host of training centres as well. Sometimes they're both. And as is usual with these things, we've had quite a low response rate, but so far we've had around 75 responses. About 60 of those are really detailed, but they do cover a whole kind of range of different scales of club. So those 75 clubs represent around 17,000 members, so quite a reasonable number of individual recreational boaters. And so these are mostly people with small dinghies on little inland lakes, but some of these clubs are very large coastal clubs with yachts as well. And there's a huge range of them. So the total turnover for those clubs is around £10 million, so around 18 million Australian dollars. But it varies from like £1,500 to £2.5 million turnover. So we've got the whole range of scales there that have responded. So two of those clubs represent around half of that turnover, and the rest of them are really kind of like a shed by the side of a lake type thing. And we asked about their energy spend, and interestingly, quite a lot of them don't really know. And it just shows that until the energy prices have gone up like this, lots of them have not really thought about this as an issue. Around a quarter of them, it's about 5% or more of their turnover as far as they know, and they're kind of affected by that tripling of the costs, because a lot of them work on very small margins through the year. They've got relatively small memberships, some of them. I think the lowest number of members in that group is about 120, going up to 1,500. So if you've got only 120 members, you're kind of working on a shoestring budget, and then you get a tripling of your energy costs. It is a big concern. We asked them all about what they'd already done. Quite a lot of them haven't done a lot on it in terms of energy efficiency. A lot of them say they don't really know what to do. They all have intermittent use of their clubhouses, so it's quite difficult to invest in them from an energy efficiency perspective. But 10 of them have solar installations, and both of the really big clubs have, but also some of the really small ones have got solar, and that's either solar water heating, which probably makes most sense for the type of demand that they have. Lots of solar electric systems, but lots of them are now thinking about it, including all those that have already got solar, thinking about adding battery systems and all sorts to try to control that volatility, if you like. But there aren't any real patterns there, and I think that shows that the clubs haven't really been considering energy as a serious issue until recently. You can't kind of say, oh well, this size of club has done X, Y, Z, or this size of turnover, this number of members. They mostly look at technologies they understand, so they think a little bit about insulation, and they think about solar because that's the thing that's out there at the moment. And obviously sailing clubs are generally by the water, and one or two of our clubs have got very efficient water source heat pumps, but it's not a technology that's generally well understood out there, so people aren't looking at that. So they're not necessarily looking at what would be best for them. They're just buying whatever people sell them from on a day-to-day basis. And the concerns they have about what they're going to do is really probably typical of lots of small clubs. Lots of them don't own their buildings, or they lease the land. They struggle to find the capital to invest, and also just finding people who can quote to do the work is a real challenge. And I think BASIS SEA, our types of organisations can probably do a lot more to help with sourcing suitable solutions for these clubs. So yeah, most of them are really concerned about what's happening, and it's that lack of knowledge, lack of forecasting ability, I suppose, is what's really challenging them. So the one area that I do know something about is, of course, our own buildings. So it's obviously not a club, and we've done our own modelling on our energy use and what we might get out of renewables. We've switched all of our buildings over to LED lighting. We've increased the insulation and so on. But RWA headquarters, based here in Hamble on the south coast of England, kind of our baseline year pre-COVID, when everything was running fairly normally, we were spending about £50,000 a year on electricity. Our gas bills are quite low. We don't use a lot of gas. On renewal, so we had a 3-year contract that runs till March next year. On renewal, that's expected to triple if you take the prices as they are now. So we're with Ecotricity, so a deep green energy company, mostly renewables, as Russ said, but driven by the gas price. So at the moment, our price is just under 15 pence per kilowatt hour, and they're quoting us 52, 53 pence a kilowatt hour for a 1-year contract starting in March. Slightly less for a 2-year contract. They seem to be getting more confident about that forward buying. And they were saying to us that if we have a mild winter, the prices in the new year will be a lot lower, and they think it will stabilize further. I guess we don't know what's going to happen in Ukraine, so that could change. But we're at the moment, well, just this week actually, we're installing a solar system. So to give you some idea, we got approval from our board a few months ago to install this when the prices weren't so high. So they gave us a budget of £100,000 effectively to spend on it. And at the time, we thought it was going to pay back in about 4 to 5 years. So modelling it on what the energy prices are at the moment and our current energy use, we think we're predicting that our energy cost from the grid would be about £150,000, so going from 50 to £150,000. But we're going to save about £40,000 of that by putting a 100 kilowatt solar system on the roof. So it will pay back in 2.5 years. So I think this is where we need to be talking to clubs about, looking more closely at those options, because it will stabilize their energy use, their energy costs. The real challenge with clubs, it's probably the same across lots of sports, is our clubs tend to be used at weekends, and so you have to start looking at energy storage as well, because the reason that we at RWA HQ will save a lot of money is we use 90% of that energy directly on site. While it's being generated, it's actually no point in us storing it, because we only export a tiny amount. For sports clubs, it's quite different, and I think it would be quite good for us to maybe work together to to commission some modelling that enables us to look at those typical usage patterns for clubs and help them, because I think it's an opportunity in a sense for us to push forward on getting energy efficiency measures in place and renewables in place while people have got this in their mind. I can imagine if the market goes back to where it was at some point in the next couple of years, people will stop talking about this again. So we could see it as a great opportunity really to push forward on carbon reduction. We put out quite a lot of advice through an operation called the Green Blue, and that kind of has classic advice for our clubs on energy saving, insulation, LED lighting, optimizing your heating controls and things, and considering renewables. And I think we're going to have to do a lot more work on that over the next year, or next 6 months really, to improve the advice we give and to improve so the real challenge seems to be for people to find people they trust to give them the advice in the detail on their particular club. So I think that's something where BASIS could and SEA as well could work together to provide that, maybe some modelling, maybe some academic studies on this to look at those typical usage patterns and help our clubs and help the kind of grassroots make these decisions, because usually there's one person in the club who understands how it all operates. And they're trying to work on their own with no peer group around them to advise them. And so I think we could really do a lot more on that side of things. And I see it as a bit of an opportunity, really. I mean, you could argue that the reason no one's been taking any notice is that energy prices have been too low, and where we are now is perhaps more where it should be in some ways. We've had cheap fossil fuels for a very long time. Renewables in theory could be cheaper, but maybe having it so cheap means we don't really consider it and value it enough. I'll leave it there.
Yeah, look, I feel that's a good point to end on. Actually, it brings it home to what should our expectations be? As you say, it's been so cheap for so long. Maybe this is leveling up the market somehow, but it gives that opportunity for these renewables to come in. I mean, I think there were two key elements, or two key words that I wrote down, or phrases of what you said. Trust. You said that a lot of the clubs don't have somebody who, they don't know the technology, they don't know what's available out there, so that trust element is important. And I think there's definitely an opportunity for BASIS and C to work on this and put out some more information, but taking this as an opportunity as well, I think is absolutely key.
Yeah, I mean, the one club I know that has put in a great water source heat pump on that trust side, they commissioned a company to do it, who didn't really know what they were doing. And when the system didn't work, the company backed off, disappeared. And then you had to have two people in the club who went online, learned about water source heat pumps, discovered that the pipe sizing was wrong, had the confidence to go ahead and change the design of the system. It's quite a difficult thing to do. So yeah, more detailed technical advice. However much information we give, however much advice we give, people come back wanting more and more all the time.
Yeah, agree. Information is absolutely key here, and it's when you get these crises that so many people are looking for that information. I'm going to bring Michael in just a moment, but I do have one question, Phil, if I may. I just wondered, from that survey that you did, was there any evidence? You said that people were concerned. There was obviously sort of concern around this. Was there any evidence of any clubs that feel they might be folding because of costs, or is the response more, we've just got to be more resilient and maybe increase the amount of money we're getting in, increase the fees that people pay, or how was that balancing out?
I think some of the smaller clubs are right on the edge. If they've only got a small number of members, some of them are, if they're leasing their properties as well, and the energy costs are included in that, then they don't have any real control. So yeah, we do have a list of clubs at risk, and that has been increasing recently. And yes, I think it will lead to some of them folding. Yeah.
So there is a direct existential threat to these clubs, which is really unfortunate.
Yeah. I mean, if you've got a very basic clubhouse that's a wooden shack and it's all electrically heated, then you've got to at least maintain your showers and your hot water if you're going to go sailing. So yes, it's a challenge.
Yeah, definitely. Phil, thank you, and we'll definitely come back to you in the discussion, I'm sure. But Michael, coming over to you, more from probably from a elite sport professional angle. Yeah, I'll open up to you. If you could do a quick introduction to yourself and then some of your thoughts as well.
Absolutely. Look, Russ and Phil, thank you so much for your sort of leading. I'm writing notes down and going, oh, that's good. That's good. So I'd love to come back and touch on some of those. So about myself, background is in corporate finance and strategy consulting. And I have a role as Senior Research Fellow at Victoria University here in Melbourne. And that's allowed me
to get out the shower.
So that's allowed me to explore in much more depth around the issues of elite sport and impact of events on cities and the dynamics around what people are recognizing in terms of different aspects of that impact. So whether it's an economic, social, and particularly environmental impact, which is getting more attention, but even within that, unpacking where people's heads are at. 2017, Arup, the global engineering firm, put out a report that looked at this idea of the fact that the way in which we go about elite sport events and elite sport was going to be changing. The idea that we would build less hard infrastructure and make much more use of existing or temporary structures. And in that, they also talked about moving forward from a basic conversation around energy towards a more sophisticated conversation around the way in which energy consumption patterns develop and how we manage them down. The unfortunate thing is I think we're still stuck quite a long way back in that conversation. So when we look around the impact, the way in which events, elite sport events are assessed, even if there is an environmental component to those elements, it's still quite basic measures. It's, you know, it's the amount of garbage, it's perhaps the percentage of renewable energy that went into the power used during that, but elements around longer term managing down the costs, things like lead status and lead scores, apart from perhaps energy, most of them in terms of building design and the like, aren't really being recognized as being critical for setting up long-term. So we've got a bit of a tension between the idea of a short-term event and the long-term need of managing an asset and a facility. And that's because the facility is often owned by a completely different organization. Not in the case of Lords, perhaps, but Melbourne Olympic Park Trust manages a number of different venues. It has Rod Laver Arena, which hosts the Australian Open, along with Margaret Court Arena. It also has Amy Park, which is the football, rugby, multi-use venue. And it has a number of different venues. And its goal, of course, is to raise the utilization rate. So Phil, I really appreciate you talking about utilization. If you've got a smaller club with low utilization, right, we need storage because we're going to burn that. The economics of large scale events for elite sport is, of course, to use them as often as possible. That's the economic, of course, that creates energy demand. And we've also got a competitive tension around this idea of creating a great environment to be in. So bigger screens, more electronic capacity going on. So we're actually increasing the energy burn rate of each event, even over and above trying to also increase the frequency of those events. So whilst, say, US stadia for football might be incredibly energy intensive during a football game, the 4 or 5 hours of a football game. And yes, you know, LED technology and like are helping with that, but they only host 8 home games a year. So the total energy demand is very intense in short periods, but actually overall it's not a long demand compared to even something like an indoor stadium like Rod Laver Arena, which is trying to be used for somewhere around about 240 days a year. So over its time, its total energy usage is much, much higher than even these incredibly intensive stadia that are designed for incredible attraction. So, but we're kind of getting pushed towards having to do that to increase the energy usage of stadia during events in particular, even over and above sort of the elite training facilities, which we'll touch on. We touched on earlier around Lord's cricket. You know, Adelaide Oval has retained its old manual scoreboard. So the energy intake for that, as I remember talking to someone, they said was it could be measured in pies and pots of beer and pints of beer, which is, you know, 4 people running up and down ladders, changing things. But in terms of energy market, it's fairly isolated from the rigors of the volatility of the energy market. Perhaps just touch on a couple of examples of where we've seen some of the good application of modern design to try and manage down those long-term energy costs. There's a couple of different ways. So I'm going to talk about Qatar at the moment, because one of the great pillars, one of the big pillars for them around 2012, as you've seen, there's been an awful lot, and we're doing a study at the moment on tracking the sentiment around Qatar on 4 different key sort of dimensions, was around sustainability. And so the air conditioning of stadia sounded like that was absolutely bonkers as an idea. And having been to Doha a number of times, you certainly go, on one level it is. But the computational design model around that air conditioning is actually really, really clever in terms of, firstly, you design the building so that it actually is isolated from, it doesn't introduce new air, hot air from outside into the building, despite the fact that it's an open air stadium. In the same way that cricket grounds or football grounds often have an open end, and therefore it's nearly impossible to retain that cooled air envelope. The second one was they actually recognized the fact that if 30 feet above the players and above the crowd is 35 degrees, so long as the crowd themselves in the stands are actually cool, it doesn't matter what the temperature 35 feet in the air is. So their air conditioning design is literally for 2 meters above the seats. And they say, if you're over 6'6" in old money, if you're over 6'6", your head's going to get warm whilst at this football, because they recognized that the energy efficiency load was only cool the things that you need to cool and ignore the rest of it. So the seating design is such that it feeds in behind the seats and then sucks up behind. So it literally only cools the bottom 2 meters. Likewise, the design for cooling the pitch is likewise only 2.5 meters high as the jets are pushed in on. But even then, they can't actually overcool the pitch, because it actually starts to interfere with the ball trajectories. If it passes too close to a jet down the side, and it disrupts that. So they have to model how much airflow could you push in without actually disrupting the ball trajectories. All of that actually lowers that design, the footprint. Of course, they've got a bit of sunshine, so it is all solar powered active use. So there's some parts of that which, whilst on one hand looks absolutely madness, actually has laid the foundations for some really good design, whether that's reversing the heat pumps and actually heating the stadia, so creating a much more warm environment in the middle of winter, playing football or watching a football match and actually being warm instead of in 14 layers as Russ is having to cozy up, or in the Northern Territory, which is a much more similar environment to Doha in terms of its humidity and heat. So there's great computational thing. The thing that I think that they perhaps haven't got credit for, which really won't flow until after the event, is the fact that they haven't patented the technology. So the great thing is they've said, this is there, please go and use. So they've made a decision to try and not monetize that per se, but actually hand it out and go, how about it? How can we lower the cost of providing a functional environment that allows for elite sport to be played in more places or over more time without the cost of fully enclosed stadia? Perhaps the other one I want to touch on is a new regional aquatic centre. Aquatic centres are horrendously energy intensive, from both the water and then dehumidifying the atmosphere. One of the things we really see is behavioural training makes a huge difference to energy managing down energy costs. So it gets stuffy, and instead of knowing how to manage the extraction units and using a heat exchanger on extraction units, staff start opening doors and windows, and we start then changing over the entire atmosphere of the volume of space, rather than trying to manage down that cost. So there's a behavioral part, and then there's places like the regional aquatic centre being built out in Eastern Victoria, which is a new elite centre for training, and they looked at the price of power then, and this was during the design phase, and recognized that despite being literally next to a power station, which is where Gippsland and the centre is, it's an old coal-fired power station which is going to be shut down, that they sunk deep bore geothermal pipes, and they have put that cost in 650 meters down. Beneath the original coal layer is 68-degree water. So they're now using that, and for the price of running a pump, literally, they are able to heat the entire aquatic centre, both the hot water pool, the main 50-meter indoor pool, the outdoor pool, heat the entire centre. Plus, interestingly enough, they're actually using excess heat to actually heat and maintain the climate in an innovation centre next door before returning the water back down into the bore. So likewise, Phil, when you were saying your solar panels are 2.5-year payback now, the original design for these was upfront cost was going to pay back in 12 years over a 30-year working life without sort of any maintenance cost of significant size. The pipes themselves are rated for 50 years. With the price of fuel energy now, that looks like that's going to be coming inside 8 or 7 years, and they're going to get 23 years of free energy because of the upfront cost. The bonus being that the contracts for that were written when credit was really cheap. So not have we paid less for the loans to cover the cost of it, we've now got 30 years of relatively free energy with no footprint, not even a solar panel in sight. Everything else is underground. So there's ways of doing it that we're seeing, and one of the big challenges we've got, last two things. So one of the big challenges is thinking about design from elite sport is too often the design awards go to lovely design. So if you're doing an aquatic centre, it's going to be big walls of glass, and that's incredibly attractive and beautiful and big open spaces, but terrible from an energy perspective. So trying to work around a functional yet energy efficient design, we need to make sure that we're getting much more of an energy efficiency skew in the ratings rather than just aesthetics. Because you win design awards on aesthetics, and then you're left with cost of running it. And that comes to the second one, which is around scenarios. So a lot of the work we do is around scenario planning and futures, and the ability to project that volatility, and it would have been possibly within, but not when it was 10 times outside the volatility analysis of future spot prices. The practical answer for that is when we think about the cost of whether it's ticket pricing for events, we're now having to build in pricing for energy costs for future events. You know, you're setting up a concert or you're hosting a World Cup. I don't know what that's going to be, but that now is to be priced into the ticket price. It's going to come out of broadcast rights to cover some of the shortfall. But if I'm an elite training center, if I'm a national sports organization, and even if I've got a share of a sports facility, and that's closer to the answer, which is where we're seeing is don't build things, share. Prices peak, I have to pay that, which means I'm pulling back on other programs. It's going to be women in sport, it's going to be youth development programs, it's going to be in opportunities to do tours or run competitions that you would have otherwise run. So the practical aspect of this is that unless we design for efficiency and actually manage those down up front, we have such uncertainty that we're going to be sharing our budget, or our budget's going to be shaved to try and keep the centre running functionally, or we have to then open it up and actually reduce the amount of elite time we can, and say have the AIS open for public usage to try and bring in new revenue streams to balance it off. So there's real challenges around that competitive strategy of, if I build in pricing for energy going forward, I become uncompetitive in the market, and therefore I don't get the attraction. If I don't build it in, it's got to go out somewhere else. So that competitive strategy means if I'm not really paying attention to finding ways to lower my energy envelope and footprint, I'm actually exposing myself to future competitive pressures and reducing the quality of what we provide to both spectators and as a place to compete in elite sport. That'll do for me. Sorry.
Yeah, no, Michael, that's interesting. There are so many elements there, and I was scribbling down notes, and the thoughts in my head were kind of changing as you were speaking around this. But it seems, I may be oversimplifying slightly, but it seems that for elite sport, there are these tensions there that seem to be quite different from what Phil was saying in terms of recreational. It's much more as a business, and so it tends to be your immediate response for increased costs is that we need to increase revenue, and then increased revenue means more activity, but then that spiral means increased costs. But then it comes to a point where you realize maybe other things suffer, and you stop funding your lower level activities, if I can term it that way. So there can be impacts, but this is quite a complex model, isn't it?
It is,
that we can't respond to.
And particularly where the elite sport funding models reward you on winning medals, championships, etc. So what do you cut? You cut the grassroots first, because that won't show up for another 15 years.
Yeah,
10, 15 years. So you cut those things first. But you're absolutely right. It is a complex relationship between the two. If we haven't factored in, can we raise the revenues?
Yeah.
They're not pots of money sitting around that people haven't competed for already.
Yeah. So again, we're identifying potential sort of existential threats to participation, which pushes on in, as you say, in 10, 15 years time, that does push on to elite level. But there are existential threats to participation in recreational sport through a global issue around energy that maybe we wouldn't have made that direct link to. So yeah, fascinating.
I was going to come in there if that's right, Russ, because I think that's certainly from the sailing perspective, we're trying to attract people in from different walks of life, and they're the ones who are going to be going to those smaller clubs. Those smaller community clubs are the ones that are most at risk. So we're kind of, we've got our equality, diversity, inclusion strategy, but if those clubs don't exist, we can't implement that. It's really hard to draw people in. You end up drawing in the people who can afford to do it already, if you like, rather than the ones who you want to bring in from more challenged socioeconomic groups and so on. So it's really hard. And then if you don't bring those people in, you don't have the level of elite athletes that you want, because you're drawing from a much smaller pool. You're not drawing from the whole community. So yeah. It impacts all the way through, because we manage the British sailing team as well as the club side of things. And and the other point I think that's really important there is that kind of capital upfront cost of things. So we're looking at a new building for the British sailing team down in Portland. The funders, UK Sport and so on, they're looking at minimizing the cost of construction rather than thinking about the lifetime value of the building, and trying to get them away from that is really hard as well. And I know Russ has been doing work on this with through BASIS of trying to influence the way the funding comes through and thinking about that in the long term rather than in the short term. But it is a real challenge for us.
You're absolutely right. There's a danger of overbuilding, of building bigger than you need, but there's almost an even more critical one of undersizing. And certainly the regional sports aquatic centre original design was too small, and they actually expanded the size and included the deep water thermal as part of an expanded plan, which actually economically then stacked up much better overall, but it did require more capital to go back to the government and say, actually, we think bigger is actually going to work better here. Not always the case, but if it is a shared facility, so there's the Centre for Sports Innovation in New Zealand being repurposed buildings in Upper Hutt, and it's one of the really new sort of elite sport training centres. But unlike some of the football training centres in, say, the UK or in Europe, it can be a shared facility. It's going to be rugby, it's going to be football, cycling, cricket, etc. So they're going to use it for as many elite sports as they can to try and make it economically stack up, rather than just saying, look, we'll just use it as a dedicated football facility. So therefore it has to be designed to be slightly bigger than it would have otherwise been, to allow for both multiple usage and of course multiple teams to be there at the same time. But overall the economics do work better in a small market like New Zealand. That, you know, you've got to make it work.
Again, another innovative response. We're starting to think in different ways, and our models are changing. I'm really keen to bring in some of our attendees. Anybody's got any questions there, if you can maybe type them in. But I know Ali, you've already popped one into the chat. Are you happy to maybe ask a question directly? I don't know if you're willing and able to unmute and ask that one directly. I'll give you a second if not. Okay, I'll just ask it to Phil. But if anybody else, if you've got any questions, please either raise a hand, pop it into the meeting chat, or directly unmute as we pause. But Phil, Ali's put in the chat, I don't know if you can see it, but around, are you doing anything to assist clubs with their on-water fleet and transitioning to electric or to biofuel? So coming away from fossil fuels for the fleet. I know it is a paradox, isn't it? Everybody looks at sailing and thinks, well, they're just blowing along in the wind. Sorry, that kind of over trivialized things. Hopefully that makes sense. There's infrastructure behind that sometimes, isn't there, that does use fossil fuels for the actual sport.
There is, and actually the RYA represents motorboating as well as sailing. So you know, about half the members have motorboats. So we are looking at this, and we produced our Carbon Pathway to Zero document a year or so ago now, which looked at the whole recreational boating sector, not just what we were doing. So yes, it's the difficulty at the moment is the cost of it. We're at the kind of stage where the electrification side of it for most applications, certainly coastal applications, is more at the kind of Tesla end of the market now, if you think about EVs. Last week I went out on an electric rib here in Hamble, going 30 knots up and down Southampton water in a £100,000 7-meter rib. It's got a well, I think it probably is a Tesla battery in the floor of it, basically. So we're trying to encourage clubs to look at this, and certainly the smaller clubs where they're doing training, it's already eminently doable. You can get an electric outboard that will run for a couple of hours on the water. If you're just using it as a safety boat, then it works very well. I myself have a little electric outboard for my tender for getting out to my boat. So all those kind of applications, it's already there, really. The trouble for clubs is if they're going to run a big open meeting or something, and they need to be out on the water all day, and they need to be able to go fast occasionally, then you're looking at quite a high expense at the moment. So some of the larger clubs are looking at this, and there are more products coming to the market, and I think the costs will come down quite quickly. So that boat I was on, 7 meters, £100,000. Next year they're bringing out a 5.5 meter rib that's going to be half that price, and that starts, and then we can start looking at it for things like the British sailing team. So from that kind of elite perspective, what they've always done in the British sailing team is they've had a fleet of nearly 50 ribs that are all identical, so they can use any of them for any application. But with some of the faster kind of foiling classes, they've had to get some bigger boats. They've already broken that model of having them all the same, so now they're seriously thinking at the bottom end of that we could start going electric. And some of that from the elite sport perspective comes down to the kind of global regulation of that sport. So if World Sailing told event organisers that they could only have a couple of fossil fuel powered boats on the water, but they could have as many electric boats as they liked, then they would start buying electric ribs, because then they would see it as that kind of marginal gains thing you get at that elite level, that if they have more of those, then the coaches can follow them more readily, and they can they can perform that little bit better. So some of it comes down to that kind of regulatory bit at the top end of the sport, really, that starts driving that behaviour down, I think. But we've certainly been advising clubs about this, and for some applications, it's already there. A classic one would be the committee boat. I don't know how much you know about sailing, but you usually have a committee boat that will go out and it'll set up the start line for the races. Usually they kind of, you spend half your time upside down trying to get in the engine bay, trying to get this old diesel started for the boat to then motor 200 meters out into a lake, drop the anchor and sit there for the day. That you could easily do with electric now, with a few solar panels, not even needing to come to shore to charge it up. So we're starting to kind of push the technology in at that level, really, to start with, and then hoping that the market will start coming from the automotive sector and giving us affordable solutions for everything else.
Phil, I've got a suggestion for your committee boat. Give them a pair of oars.
You want to try that out on the Hamble on a falling spring tide out here? You won't get very far. You'll be straight out the river in no time at all.
Showing my naivety. Okay, does anybody have any questions? I'm really keen that if you've got some, you can jump in.
I was just going to pick up the point. No, I think we've got Olivia. I think you're from tennis. I'm just trying to pick up a couple of things that Michael, you've said, because one thing which I wonder from a tennis perspective, Michael talked about, is there more of the sports moving indoor as opposed to outdoor to almost, address some of the climate change issues, but then that's actually creating more of an energy conundrum. I don't know if that's something that tennis has been dealing with, or there's other more energy priorities.
Yeah, so I work, hello, Olivia from Tennis West. One of the things we struggle with is heat over in Western Australia, and multiple 40-degree days, just making it really challenging. I mean, we get rain and that also impacts training, but heat is a real challenge. And so what we're keen to have is more undercover courts, so that don't require air conditioning and that sort of cooling, but will just provide shade. So sort of an open-sided undercover structure, and to be able to reduce court temperature, provide shade, to minimise some of those sort of weather impact, and then protect from rain, in winter, because we lose a significant amount of play at either end, rain or heat. So anything over 37 degrees, and we're looking at, particularly in some parts of WA, consistently getting weather over 45 degrees. And I just see that's getting worse. So to be able to combat that is a challenge. In fully enclosed indoor, I've previously managed a netball centre that was fully air conditioned, 4-court indoor aircon, and it is expensive to run, but people also pay a premium for that. So I guess it's that people really do seek that out. They want to be able to train and play, but it's more for your elite athletes. It's not an everyday type environment. So that does start servicing probably that niche, more high performance athlete. Day-to-day tennis players are going to put up, and netball players are going to cope with all the weathers and struggle through that a little bit. But yeah, the costs of those sort of structures are prohibitive, and we have no undercover courts in the whole of Western Australia. So it's something we're looking at multiple $1 million worth of investment to be able to do.
Wow.
Yeah. Can I just, on that, Olivia, you Catherine drew you out there and got you on camera, but if
I was hiding away with small children leaping all over me earlier.
That's part of the fun of Zoom. Do you feel that this energy crisis in particular has driven some sort of more innovative thought, or was this something that was planned anyway, maybe just around whatever, carbon emissions or something? But has this focused in a bit more?
It has. So Tennis Australia, so I'm employed by Tennis West, not Tennis Australia, but we work really closely. Tennis Australia has sustainability as one of its 3 top priorities moving forward. And so we've now got working groups around sustainability. Tennis Australia has employed a director of sustainability just in the last year. So I think there has been a real shift in that. We're also seeing our state government, so through the Department of Sport, putting forward funding for state sporting bodies. So we've benefited from 50k to put up some solar panels. They're getting installed in the next couple of weeks. It wasn't enough money to also add in battery, but we'll work on that in time. And we've had energy audits done, and we are putting in a couple of electric vehicle charging stations, because there's a view to move our fleet to, not all our fleet, because regional WA is massive, and but for the metro-based stuff, you can't go more than about 300 k's outside of WA on electric vehicle. But anyway, so we're starting to future-proof and move towards some of those initiatives, and there's capital funding to support that, which is really cool.
Yeah, excellent. I mean, I partly ask you just a sort of personal anecdote. I was sustainability manager at Lord's Cricket Ground for 11 years. And I put in, I really wanted to force down energy use from a carbon perspective.
Yeah.
And this is, I left like 3 years ago. So this, I'm talking 5-6 years ago, push us down to reduce our carbon emissions. And I went back just a few months ago and sat in on one of their sustainability meetings, and they'd been charged with, the chief executive said, I want you to reduce energy use by 30%, pretty stringent controls in there. And they'd gone through everything they could possibly do, presented those. And I essentially said, this is what I said we should do 6 years ago. But I was talking about carbon, and now they're talking about cost. So the impetus is higher. Look, it's great. I'm very happy we do it either way. I wish we'd done it.
I was going to say, whatever's the motivation probably doesn't matter, because it achieves both objectives. Exactly. It's just talking to whatever motivates people.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. It's interesting that this is now, as Phil said, it's an opportunity, maybe driven through, fear, possibly, the costs causing all sorts of other problems, but it is the positive from it is it's potentially an opportunity. So
yeah,
I know we're coming.
I think it's really interesting. So thank you for letting me listen into all of that.
Thanks for jumping in there.
Yeah. Thank you. I know we're close to the end of the time. I know Ridian, you just put one into the chat. Are you happy to unmute and ask that question?
Sure. I mean, it was, I guess, a general question, not really directed to anyone in particular, but just I guess coming back to the thing of with, I guess, particularly smaller clubs and facilities, and like the cost of installing, for example, solar panels and or battery storage. I know that in some parts of Australia, there's like some work done with councils and sports clubs to do some of those installations and share costs. And I think some of that has to do with who owns a particular facility. But it'd be interesting to hear, I guess, what's happening elsewhere, particularly in Britain, in regards to that. And I suppose something that also comes to mind is like in Australia, like Cricket for Climate's initiatives in getting cricket players to help fund their clubs to get solar and batteries in those cricket grounds, and then also be able to use that as like a community facility. Microgrids, and just sort of helping to stabilise things and replace gas as a bit of a grid balancing mechanism.
Yeah. I mean, Phil, are you aware of anything in sort of from a UK perspective of sharing costs or working with councils? I mean, even for your technical background as well.
Yeah, I mean, it's a really interesting question, because it's something that was around a few years ago, and it's not something I'd really considered, but it's something we should look at again, really. I know when solar was quite expensive, there were opportunities in the UK to set up what they call a virtual grid connection point. So you'd have a school, for example, that put a solar system on its roof, and when the school wasn't open, it would sell the energy to the local community at a lower price than they would pay for the grid. But at a higher price that the school would get by exporting that excess energy. And that probably would work again now, because I know, selling your energy into the grid, even though the prices are up at 50p, you still get 5 or 10 pence a unit for your embedded generation, which is not good. So actually, it's a really good question. It's something we should look at more. I would think if you were doing that, it might not be worth even having the battery, because what you would be doing then is using the energy locally when the club wasn't needing it. So that might be a cheaper way to do it. But the question is, I guess, probably around the regulatory side, whether you can put in that effectively a grid point that's not at a premises, but somewhere further up the line, so that you can buy and sell locally. But yeah, that's certainly worth considering. So yeah, thanks for that. I'll have a think on that.
Yeah. Any perspective, Michael, at all on that one?
Similar idea. I mean, Phil's touched on that, which is that the advantage of large stadia and elite sport facilities is that they're large. As the centre point area in the Melbourne Park precinct was developed with solar panels on top. So if you can take large stadia and put solar panels, most elite sport facilities tend to be quite centrally located in metropolitan areas. I mean, so you've actually then got effectively a generator situated in a very local area. It sort of echoes of the Mars factory in Slough years ago used to export its local, used to actually be the provider to the local community of their energy supply. You actually get your energy bill from Mars Corporation, which was always a bit unusual. But I think that as the price of solar and the efficiency of solar panels continues to improve, those opportunities to add into the grid, to add a generation point for the community, will become much more viable, particularly around community assets like sports facilities. And even in regional areas, Olivia, I know that it's hard to get to them necessarily from Perth to Geraldton or Exmouth, but in an EV, but they tend to have quite tight clusters. Bendigo, for instance, has a very tight envelope in terms of its intensity of sports facilities, and being able to generate across all of those and then out to the community is a really great initiative, and it works within a local government area. So I think innovation, really, you've really brought to light a really good initiative, and part of that is going to be innovation by the councils to allow for this as much as it is the technology to do it.
Yeah, definitely.
I'm just thinking of one other. I've just recently completed, I'm still doing the assessments for, but just completed the company directors course. And it was really interesting hearing from a board director point of view how big a push the environmental sustainability lens and social responsibility is for board directors, not just sport, all industries. And I just think increasingly it's not going to just be greenwashing and looking good and a nice media story. It's just genuinely going to be part within the next 10 years. It's just going to be commonplace. If you're not doing it, you're just going to have to.
As Russ has said, you may not be here.
I just thought it was really interesting, and people who've done that course sort of 10 years ago, like, oh, that wasn't even part of the language, let alone part of the formal education. So
it's definitely a transition, isn't it, from it's sort of one of the many risks, but now it's actually, I think, transcended to be at the front and center of the risk. And I know Scott was talking about this the other day. We were at a conference in Melbourne where the idea of having catastrophic climate events, should now, as a company director, actually be front and center around managing your risk. You can't just say because it's unprecedented, you don't need to manage that risk. The legal precedents are there to now say you actually need to. You may not be able to, judge that it's going to happen, but when it's going to happen, but it will happen. So directors need to be taking reasonable precautions.
Yeah. And just in our conversation today, we have established this is an existential risk for all sorts of levels, and even where it's not that direct, clear risk, it doesn't take many levels of thought to actually understand that this is going to have an impact on sport, the way we play sport, future performance at national level, etc. So all of these questions do have significant impacts. We are a bit over. I think we've even gone beyond sort of 1 hour as well. We did open up sort of 5 minutes late, so I was quite happy with 5 minutes over. But maybe we've gone 10. But look, it's been a fantastic discussion, and I think it's traditional for me to ask panelists to sum up, and I think we've gone beyond that time. So I'll just thank Phil and Michael, and for Catherine and Scott for organising this. And my summary from this discussion is, we kind of started this off thinking about an energy crisis, and yes, look, it is there. It is an issue that we've got to manage. But I'll go back to sort of Phil's thought, and Michael echoed this, that it's an opportunity. You know, with any sustainability issue, I think we've got to look at, there's that way of looking which is kind of doom and gloom and problem, and that's valid. But there's also this thing to say it's an opportunity to change, and we've got to take that trajectory and change the way that we manage things. So with that optimistic thought, and Phil also used the word trust, you know, we've got trusted organizations, but we need to make change, and this is definitely an opportunity. So I'll leave it there. Catherine or Scott, do you need anything to finalize?
No, just thank you everybody for joining us. I know it's, you know, evening here and early morning for you, so appreciate everybody's time and our speakers and our participants. So, and thanks for us. Yeah,
and it's great, you know, we love this opportunity to talk to you guys and share experience literally across the globe. So a great association between BASIS and C, and thanks everybody, whether it's morning, whether it's evening. Have a great rest of your day.
Thank you. Thanks everybody.
Thanks everyone. Bye.
Bye-bye.